Hello, I'm Nick, and this is Today in Philosophy of History for Thursday, 22 February 2024. It is the 135th anniversary of the birth of Robin George Collingwood, better known to posterity as R.G. Collingwood, who was born in Cartmel, just south of the Lake District, on this date in 1889. Collingwood is largely remembered as the man who made philosophy of history respectable in the Anglophone world. His most important book on philosophy of history, The Idea of History, published in 1946, was assembled posthumously from his papers by T.M. Knox, who also translated some of Hegel into English. It has been said that Collingwood wrote a long book about history and then put everything he wanted to say into an appendix. And the appendices probably are the most interesting parts of the idea of history, but it was actually Knox who did this, not Collingwood. The Idea of History as we know it today was not the book for which Collingwood wanted to be remembered. The Principles of History, left unfinished at his death, was supposed to be his magnum opus in the philosophy of history. Parts of this manuscript, which were known on his death, were used by Knox for assembling the idea of history. And after that, the manuscript was lost. It was rediscovered in 1995 and it was published in 1999. So what we have of Collingwood's mature philosophy of history is incomplete and fragmentary, but the ideas of philosophers rarely are transmitted to posterity in the form that they intended. So join the club, I guess you could say. Collingwood wasn't only a philosopher, he was also an archaeologist and a specialist in Roman Britain. So you could say that Collingwood literally got his hands dirty in working with history. But despite this engagement with the nitty-gritty of history, Collingwood's philosophy of history is usually called idealist. There was in England at the time, in the late 19th century and the early 20th century, a significant school of thought that we now know as British idealism that included philosophers like F.H. Bradley and J.M.E. McTaggart, who had significant intellectual debts to Hegel. Collingwood is also known as an idealist, but is a different kind of idealist. Despite being part of the idealist tradition and despite being a philosopher of history, there's almost nothing of Hegel in Collingwood's philosophy of history. Part of this is due to Collingwood's unique approach to idealism, which followed from his unique philosophical method, or what we might better say is a unique interpretation of philosophical method. He wasn't interested in an ontological formulation of idealism like we find in Bishop Berkeley, for example, and the criticisms of Bishop Berkeley by Dr. Johnson, who really rejected that kind of ontological idealism. We could rather call Collingwood's idealism a kind of conceptual account of idealism. That's the term that's used in the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, and it's, I guess, the best term we could find to cover it. It's better just to read Collingwood and figure out what he says himself. Collingwood had an explicit methodological justification for this in his theory of concepts that he formulated in his early book, Essay on Philosophical Method. And these ideas inform all his work after that. And here is how it is expressed in the New Leviathan. Quote, "Man's body and man's mind are not two different things, but the same thing, as known in two different ways. Not a part of man, but the whole of man is body insofar as he approaches the problem of self-knowledge by the methods of natural science. Not a part of man, but the whole of man is mind insofar as he approaches the problem of self-knowledge by expanding and clarifying the data of reflection," unquote. For Collingwood's conception of history, the whole of man is mind. And one of the best known quotes from Collingwood is, "All history is the history of thought." In the Principles of History, he immediately follows this assertion that all history is a history of thought with this, quote, "This includes the history of emotions insofar as these emotions are essentially related to the thoughts in question, not of any emotions that may happen to accompany them, nor for that matter of any thoughts that may happen to accompany them," unquote. So there he's making an implicit distinction between essential and inessential thoughts and emotions and anything else that may come into the cognitive expression of what an original actor or agent in history felt and experienced. Given Collingwood's idiosyncratic formulation of idealism, he stands a little outside and apart from the familiar categories we use in philosophy of history, but he has been placed in recognizable schools of thought. Georg Iggers, in his excellent book, The German Conception of History, wrote, quote, "Droysen, Dilthey, and Collingwood had seen the re-experiencing of historical actors' mental processes as the core of historical understanding," unquote. And Ted Carr, in What is History, wrote, quote, "The reconstitution of the past in the historian's mind is dependent on empirical evidence, but is not in itself an empirical process and cannot consist in a mere recital of facts. On the contrary, the process of reconstitution governs the selection and interpretation of the facts. This, indeed, is what makes them historical facts. History," says Professor Oakeshott, who on this point stands near Collingwood, "is the historian's experience. It is made by nobody save the historian. To write history is the only way of making it," unquote. So we could locate Collingwood in what you might call an unrecognized tradition of thought that passes from Droysen and Dilthey through Collingwood and Oakeshott. Standing apart as he did, Collingwood could afford to be critical of more familiar schools of thought in history. And Collingwood was especially critical of what he called in many of his books, scissors and paste history. Quote, "There is a kind of history which depends altogether upon the testimony of authorities. As I have already said, it is not really history at all, but we have no other name for it. The method by which it proceeds is first to decide what we want to know about, and then to go in search of statements about it, oral or written, purporting to be made by actors in the events concerned, or by eyewitnesses of them, or by persons repeating what actors or eyewitnesses have told them, or have told their informants, or those who have informed their informants, and so on. Having found in such a statement something relevant to his purpose, the historian excerpts it and incorporates it, translated if necessary, and recast into what he considers a suitable style in his own history. As a rule, where he has many statements to draw upon, he will find that one of them tells him what another does not. So both or all of them will be incorporated. Sometimes he will find that one of them contradicts another. Then, unless he can find a way of reconciling them, he must decide to leave one out. And this, if he is conscientious, will involve him in a critical consideration of the contradictory authorities' relative degree of trustworthiness. And sometimes one of them, or possibly even all of them, will tell him a story which he simply cannot believe, a story characteristic perhaps of the superstitions or prejudices of the author's time or the circle in which he lived, but not credible to a more enlightened age, and therefore to be admitted. History constructed by excerpting and combining the testimonies of different authorities, I call scissors and paste history. I repeat that it is not really history at all because it does not satisfy the necessary conditions of science. But until lately, it was the only kind of history in existence, and a great deal of the history people are still reading today, and even a good deal of what people are writing, belongs to this type," unquote. We can think of this attack on what Collingwood calls scissors and paste history as an unsympathetic and somewhat malicious account of the kind of history that Leopold von Ranke had established as the accepted method of scholarly history in the 19th century. Collingwood doesn't ever name Ranke where he is criticizing scissors and paste history, but the implication is clear. So given Collingwood's distinctive, unique approach to idealism and approach to history through idealism, He needs a new method for history, but it can't be Ranke's scissors and paste method. And it can't be the method of the natural sciences, because while Collingwood was among those philosophers of history who assert that history is definitely a science, not an art, he argued that history has its own distinct methodology, not the methodology of the natural sciences. And while Collingwood said that history is a science, but a science that does not use the methods of the natural sciences, he also did not employ the distinction between the ideographic and the nomothetic sciences that was developed by Windelband and Rickert. So Collingwood's method of history can't be the method of the ideographical sciences, so Collingwood has to blaze his own trail. Quote, history is a science, but a science of a special kind. It is a science whose business is to study the events not accessible to our observation and to study these events inferentially, arguing to them from something else which is accessible to our observation and which the historian calls evidence for the events in which he is interested, unquote. For Collingwood, history is constructed in the mind of the historian. Quote, when a man thinks historically, he has before him certain documents or relics of the past. His business is to discover what the past was that has left these relics behind it. For example, the relics are written words, and in that case, he has to discover what the person who wrote these words meant by them. This means discovering the thought in the widest sense of the word, which he expressed by them. To discover what this thought was, the historian must think it again for himself, unquote. One of the distinctive features of what I would call Collingwood's cognitive methodology in history is what he calls a priori historical imagination. Quote, I described constructive history as interpolating between the statements borrowed from our authorities other statements implied by them. Thus, our authorities tell us that on one day Caesar was in Rome, and on a later day in Gaul. They tell us nothing about his journey from one place to the other. But we interpolate this with a perfectly good conscience. This act of interpolation has two significant characteristics. First, it is in no way arbitrary or merely fanciful. It is necessary, or in Kantian language, a priori. If we filled up the narrative of Caesar's doings with fanciful details such as names of persons he met along the way and what he said to them, the construction would be arbitrary. It would be, in fact, the kind of construction that is done by unhistorical novelists. But if our construction involves nothing that is not necessitated by the evidence, it is a legitimate historical construction of a kind without which there can be no history at all. Secondly, what is in this way inferred is essentially something imagined. If we look out over the sea and perceive a ship, and 5 minutes later look again and perceive it in a different place, we find ourselves obliged to imagine it as having occupied intermediate positions when we were not looking. This is already an example of historical thinking, and it is not otherwise that we find ourselves obliged to imagine Caesar as having traveled from Rome to Gaul when we are told that he was in these different places at these successive times. This activity with this double character, I shall call a priori imagination, unquote. That is from section 2 of the Epilegomena from the Idea of History. As a cognitive method, which can be constructed very differently by different thinkers, Collingwood's cognitive methodology is subject to significant interpretation and dispute. William Drey has written an entire book on historical reenactment based on Collingwood's philosophy of history, and he's not the only one who's written about it. Collingwood is mentioned on both sides of the Carr-Elton debate with a certain ambivalence on both sides. Carr gives us the advantages and disadvantages of Collingwood's method, and Elton says that philosophies like Collingwood's are a response to the extreme relativism of historians like Carr, and if those who hold this philosophy, that is to say Collingwood's philosophy, are also historians, their history can't even be judged by their philosophical views. So he's basically saying that the historical work is compartmentalized and the philosophical work is essentially epiphenomenal. Collingwood's distinctive idealism and a philosophy of history based on this distinctive idealism, such that, quote, the history of thought, and therefore all history is reenactment of past thought in the historian's own mind, unquote, means that natural history cannot be history in Collingwood's sense. This in turn means that human history cannot be integrated into a larger context of natural history, which is exactly what we would expect from a species of idealism. So if the idealism was not evident earlier on in his development of conception of his conception of history, it certainly becomes evident later when we have to exclude all of natural history from human history. Collingwood says, quote, "The historian investigating any event in the past makes a distinction between what may be called the outside and the inside of an event. By the outside of an event, I mean everything belonging to it which may be described in terms of bodies and their movements. The passage of Caesar, accompanied by certain men, across a river called the Rubicon at one date, or the spilling of his blood on the floor of the Senate House at another. But the inside of the event, by the inside of the event, I mean that in it, which can only be described in terms of thought, Caesar's defiance of republican law or the clash of constitutional policy between himself and his assassins," unquote. In the next paragraph, he adds, in the case of nature, this distinction between the outside and the inside of the event does not arise. The events of nature are mere events, not the acts of agents whose thought the scientist endeavors to trace. It is true that the scientist, like the historian, has to go beyond the mere discovery of events, but the direction in which he moves is very different. Instead of conceiving the event as an action and attempting to rediscover the thought of its agent, penetrating from the outside to the event to its inside, the scientist goes beyond the event, observe its relation to others, and thus brings it under a general formula or law of nature. To the scientist, nature is always and merely a phenomena, not in the sense of being defective in reality, but in the sense of being a spectacle presented to his intelligent observation, whereas the events of history are never mere phenomena, never mere spectacles for contemplation, but things which the historian looks not at, but through to discern the thought within them," unquote. Here, Collingwood gives the relationship between his historical methodology and the methodology of natural science, which latter Windelband had called nomothetic, in contrast to the ideographic methodology of history as he saw it. The natural scientist, according to Collingwood, fills the void of the interior of his events, known only through observation from the outside, with the operation of natural law. The historian, by contrast, fills the interiority of historical agents, which he knows not to be void because they are agents, with a thought that he reenacts on their behalf. In addition to his works on history and art, Collingwood also wrote several treatises on methodology and metaphysics. And these books place his historical thought in a larger metaphysical context, which then substitutes for the naturalistic context that is lost through his idealism. As I said earlier, Collingwood dispenses with nature because you cannot give a philosophy of history from nature because you only see it from the outside, whereas the history of agents and thinking agents you can see from the inside. So we lose the natural history context, but we gain a metaphysical context. In an essay on metaphysics, his history comes up quite frequently. And Collingwood makes the assertion in that book that metaphysics itself is an historical science. Collingwood argues that metaphysics is the science of absolute presuppositions, but this science of absolute presuppositions must itself be historical. Quote, "Because the metaphysician is a special kind of historian, his training should consist first in general historical education, secondly in special attention to the history of science, and finally in concentrating on problems of the following type. Here is a document providing evidence about the history of science. What light does it throw on the question, what absolute presuppositions have been made?" Unquote. So not only does metaphysics illuminate and expand history, supplying to it that context that was lost from the loss of natural history, but history is part of the metaphysical enterprise, because the metaphysician, in accomplishing his discovery of absolute presuppositions, must think historically in order to do that. So, happy birthday, R.G. Collingwood, and thanks for listening.